And she said, so when your husband is having his little emotional moment, think of the Tasmanian devil and his tornado, right? He'd get so angry and worked up and he'd spin himself around and make the dust cloud and the little tornado. And she said, you right now think that when he has that tornado, it's your job to do something about it. And she said, I want to shift that a little bit for you. Your actual job is to just get out of the way and let him have his little tornado and stop sticking your hand in there or your foot in there or your whatever in there to try to stop it. She said, your only job is to stay out of the way and not get sucked in.
Welcome back to the You Need a Counselor podcast. This is a show presented by Heart and Solutions Counseling Agency. We release new episodes every Sunday at 5 p.m. Central and encourage you to batch up that laundry, put away the dishes, plan for the week ahead, or do any other task that might seem daunting while you give our show a listen. You might just be encouraged to call your therapist, connect with this week's guest, or seek out those services you've been considering for a while but haven't made the commitment to yet. If you are in the state of Iowa and are in need of mental or behavioral health counseling, give us a call at 1-800-531-4236. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome back to the You Need a Counselor podcast. My name is Dr. Julie Johnson. I'm the president and founder here at Heart and Solutions Counseling Agency in Iowa.
Hi, I'm Eva ZobianWolf. I am the founder of Eva Z Wellness. I'm an adaptive yoga therapist and mind-body specialist.
And I'm Chrissa Hunt. I am Vice President at Heart and Solutions in charge of our Behavioral Health Department. And this is our podcast, You Need a Counselor. So we are designed for people curious about counseling but have barriers keeping them from experiencing the benefits of counseling. Our mission is to share stories about counseling, good, bad, and indifferent, and spread the message that everyone can benefit from mental health and behavioral health counseling services.
Our guest today is Alyssa Decker. Alyssa is a coach helping women who might find themselves in high conflict relationships. Alyssa uses her personal journey through counseling to help other women to resolve stressful situations, resolve inner anxiety, and help point them towards that safe and authentic emotional equilibrium within ourselves. She is the host of the podcast Equilibrium Echoes, and she is also a coach at coachingwithalyssa.com. Welcome, Alyssa. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today with you ladies.
Now, we are so excited to hear about the coaching that you provide because it really does sound like you've really narrowed down who it is that you are here to help and what kinds of situations that you're here to help them with. How did you kind of come to that? How did you know who you wanted to be helping?
Well, like for so many of us in caring professions, we get here often because we have an experience, right? And other people help us, and then we want to help other people. So my background is that I came out of a 19-year abusive relationship that I didn't even realize was abusive for about 16 years. So I got out of that relationship, and it took a few years of coaching and therapy to learn new techniques, to heal trauma, to learn how to show up differently in my relationships. And so now what I'm so passionate about doing is helping other women that are in these kind of relationships. And some of my clients are in an intimate relationship that's high conflict. Some of them are dealing with bosses or coworkers that are high conflict. And some of them even are family members, like a parent. And I like to tell my clients, like, there are ways that you can show up differently and you can change the dynamics in these relationships, whether or not you choose to leave. Like, just because you identify that you're in a high conflict relationship doesn't mean the answer is leaving. Sometimes the answer is handling that better, right? Or being in a better place yourself so that you are responding differently. And for me, when I got out of this marriage, like, I thought leaving was going to fix things because I wasn't living with him anymore. And then a few weeks later, I had this big wake up moment where I realized like I have 5 kids and I have to still see him several times a week to hand kids back and forth. And I was getting so triggered every time I had to see him. And I was like, hold on a minute. Like, it's not supposed to be this way. Like, I thought leaving with, and I realized that just because I wasn't even in that situation all the time didn't mean I didn't have to deal with it. And so as I learned these different techniques for managing what was going on inside my internal world, it changed the way I showed up. And now he can call me or text me or say whatever he wants or decide he thinks he wants to yell at me in my driveway. And I show up totally differently. And I can walk away from that now, not being triggered at all and feeling really proud of myself for how I responded to whatever he decided to do. And so that process for me took several years. I think it takes time for a lot of us, depending on how much trauma is involved and what kind of relationship we're in. But that's really my mission, is to empower women to not just be passive observers or victims in our relationships, but to show up in a way that we can be proud of and take back that power and autonomy for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like you work with a wide variety of women in all kinds of different conflict relationships. Does the way you like approach working with different clients, whether it's like their coworker, their parent, or a partner, differ? Like, do you do different techniques with clients depending on who their conflict is with?
Yeah, some of them are the same, but some of them are different. Like if you are dealing with a boss, that's a little bit of a different conversation than if you're dealing with an intimate partner, because with an intimate partner, they're there all the time. Like your lives are completely intertwined. Whereas with a boss, it's probably, a few minutes a day here and there kind of interactions. And so that's much easier to deal with, I think. And also, I think with something like a boss, a situation like that, we tend to feel like um, the decision about whether we stay or whether we leave is much easier than when we're like in a live-in kind of relationship, whether it's a marriage or just a partner. Um, a boss, like I have had clients tell me, I can't leave my job. I can't leave my job. And I say, yes, actually you can. It's just you have to decide what's best for you, right? That's one of the things that I love to kind of point out to clients is everything in life is a choice. And I didn't realize that for such a long time. I thought, oh, I'm married. I made this commitment. I have these kids. Like, I don't have a choice but to stay. And one of the things that my therapist said to me that was so helpful, she said, Alyssa, you do have a choice. And I was like, no, I don't. She's like, yes, you do. And she said, you have a choice about everything, everything. You could choose not to get out of bed in the morning and feed your kids. That choice will have consequences, clearly. Like if you do that enough times, you're not going to have your kids anymore, right? Um, but it is a choice. And so when we reframe that in our minds, it gives us our power back. So in the case of someone who's dealing with a really high conflict boss, I would tell them, you get to choose whether or not you show up and go to work. And if you don't show up, you're probably going to lose your job. And that's going to have consequences. Or you can quit and find another job, and that will also have consequences. But we have to stop saying we don't have a choice, because we're giving away our power when we do that.
There's so much that you said that was just absolutely amazing. I loved how you are bringing everybody back into themselves and back to their autonomy. Can you speak to some of the methods that you use in doing that? Are you doing this with journaling, affirmations? What's your niche methods that you use?
Well, a lot of it is mindset shifts, and some of that comes through journaling. One of the things that I like to have my clients do is when they're in a situation where they're feeling a lot of stress or anxiety or they're getting triggered, I tell them to, after that situation is over, right? Because you can't really analyze the situation when you're in it, especially not when there's a lot of emotion involved. But after that situation is over, I tell them to write down what happened, the facts. He said blank, she said blank, I did this. Then I tell them to write down their thoughts about that, right? Because we're all interpreting the facts about what's happening in a particular way, whatever that is. So let's say, for example, for me, one of the things that happened regularly was after I moved out, my husband would come to pick up the kids and he would decide that we were going to stand in the driveway so he could have his little tirade and tell me all the nasty things he wanted to tell me. And so in my example, I would write down husband in driveway said XYZ, right? And then my response was usually at that point in my life to stand there and cry and not say anything. So that's the facts, right? That's what happened. So then my thoughts about that would be the next thing I would tell them, or in my case that I would write down. My thoughts were, he thinks I'm an idiot, right? He's really angry with me, whatever my conscious thoughts are about that. And then the next thing is to write down how that made me feel. And this is so important because so often what we're thinking is what's dictating what we feel. Right? So when I wrote down he thinks I'm an idiot, that made me feel, and this takes some time, right? If someone is doing this for the first time, it's going to take some work to be able to frame this and put it on paper. But my feeling then would be something like shame or embarrassment or guilt or anger. Like there's a whole variety of emotions I could have in response to that thought. And then once you get all that on paper and you've sort of identified this is what happened, this is what I thought, this is how I felt. Then the next thing is, how did I show up? How did I act based on that feeling that I had? So for me, I stood there and cried. I walked away feeling about 3 inches tall, right? And so then what I tell them to do is go back to that thoughts step and ask yourself, next time this happens, how can I think differently? How can I reframe this differently? And so what I started to do was, instead of going down this rabbit hole of he thinks I'm an idiot and I'm stupid because I did whatever, I started to retrain my brain to think, he thinks I'm an idiot, but that's not what I think. Or he thinks I'm an idiot, but I know better, right? Just because he thinks that doesn't mean I have to believe and I have to buy in. And so after a few times of this same circumstance repeating itself, I started to notice that my thought process was different. And then I started to notice how my feelings were different. And then my body started to react differently. It was this whole chain reaction. But it goes back to those thoughts, right? And as soon as I convinced myself that just because he said it didn't mean it didn't make it true, that was the real game changer. And so for me, that first time that we were standing in my driveway and he started yelling and I didn't start shaking and I didn't start crying, I wasn't strong enough yet to speak back to him what I really wanted to say. And I wasn't strong enough yet to just walk away. But I didn't have that emotional internal anxiety meltdown that I was having, right? And I remember walking in my front door and closing my door and just doing this little happy dance because I was so proud of myself that I didn't allow him to have that effect on me that he had been having for years and years and years. And so I hope that kind of answers your question, but that's one of the big processes that I like to take clients through. And I remind them, like, it's going to take time. You can't just magically in 1 minute tell your brain to believe something different, because we have these thought processes that are so worn. Like, we're so used to walking down this path. It takes time to train our brains to think differently and to develop new thought processes. But that is a huge part of changing our reactions and how we show up.
Absolutely. I love how what you're doing is really focusing on the only things that we have control of in this world.
Yes.
And when we go to try to change a situation, or we go to try to change our outcomes or our external world, there is sometimes this automatic path to, well, I'm going to change behavior. And it goes straight from like, I don't like this outcome that I'm having, so I'm going to change either my behavior or I'm going to change somebody else's behavior. and,
Right.
and by changing my behavior, and when we go straight to behavior, we miss out on the things that we actually do have control of, because our behaviors are driven by our feelings, and we cannot change our feelings. We have no control over our feelings whatsoever, but we have absolute control over the thoughts that create those feelings and trigger
Yes.
those feelings. And so I love that you're looking at that inner heart. I think sometimes with intimate partner violence, there's a tendency in our field, in the therapy field at least, might be different in coaching, there's a tendency to try to stay away from that internal part because it is so easy to internalize other people's behaviors. It's so easy to internalize and do self-blaming and do self-trigger. And what I love about what you're doing is you're saying, no, I still get to look at the things that I do have control over. It
Right.
doesn't mean that it's my fault that something happened. It does mean that I have power to have a different outcome next time. It is so empowering what you're doing.
Yes. And I love what you said there, because for me, I knew, okay, if I could have changed him in 19 years, I would have done it many times over, right? But as soon as I finally got to a place where I was like, I am never going to change him, so I have to change me, because I refuse to spend the next 15 years of having, I mean, my youngest is only 3. I have a lot of years left of having to interact with him. I refuse to spend the next 15 years feeling like this. So how do I change this? Like, how do I change my feelings and my anxiety and my triggers and all of that without changing him? That was a huge turning point for me when I got to that place where I was like, yeah, okay, he's not going to change. I can't change him. And the other thing that you said about changing, like when we try to jump straight to changing our actions, I wasn't, I was not in that moment capable of changing my actions. I truly wasn't. Like, there was a part of me that thought, okay, when he shows up, I'm just going to tell him like it is, and I'm just going to stand up to him, and I'm going to whatever. Wasn't going to happen because of what was happening inside of me. Like, my emotional state, my coping skills, all of that was not at a place where I could do that. And for me, like, one of the first steps that I took was I just gave myself permission to stop trying to stand up to him. Like, I gave myself permission to just be silent and let that be okay. So when he would yell, I couldn't defend myself. I couldn't, because of the years and years of habits, right? And the years of relationship dynamics. But when I just released all of that and said, okay, I'm going to give myself permission to just not say anything, and I'm going to be proud of myself for just doing that. I was being quiet before, but it changed the conversation in my head, because instead of then berating myself for being quiet, I then realized that that was part of learning to stand up for myself. And I got to a place where I was proud of myself for just not being able to not engage and be okay with it. So it's sometimes those little things, like, I remember thinking in that conversation, like, I'm still shaking, I'm still crying, I'm still having all of my anxiety reactions that I would have when he would yell and scream. But there was a part of me that was like, I am choosing to be silent and let that be enough. And it was such a tiny little step, but sometimes that's where we have to start. And yeah, I remember that was another milestone moment for me when I was like, it's okay if I don't respond and defend myself. And it's just where I am right now.
What helped you get into counseling and kind of realize like, okay, I need to leave him? Like, how did you go from being in the relationship with him to going to counseling and to getting away from him?
Oh, that's a great question. And I love this question because part of what I do now, in all of my social media and in these podcast interviews is exactly what someone did for me. So the story is, I was driving somewhere, I don't know, taking the kids somewhere as I did all the time. And my favorite radio station was off the air. And so I started scrolling and there was this woman on some station, some show, I don't know, I couldn't even tell you, but she was talking and she caught my attention because she was describing her marriage. And it sounded exactly like mine. And I, like, from the first sentence, I was completely hooked because I had never heard someone describe something so close to my relationship, right? And at this point, like, I'm still trying to convince myself, like, this is just hard. It's hard, but it's normal. And it's, maybe someday it'll get better. Like, I was still in all those, like, thoughts that, kept me stuck for so long. She's describing this and I'm just listening and I just start crying, like tears just streaming down my face because I felt like for the first time ever, someone else could identify. Like I could see my story and what someone else was saying. And then after about 10 or 15 minutes of her telling her story, she described her relationship that she had just been talking about as abusive. And I remember, like, my jaw hit the floor. I was like, wait, no, like, no. Right? Because in my mind, immediately I made the connection. Like, she was describing a relationship just like mine. And if hers was abusive, then did that mean that mine was? Like, I fought with that thought for months. That really stuck with me. And I was just back and forth, like, is it? No, it's just hard. Like, no, he just has some anger issues. No. But eventually, after a few months, I called a friend who I knew had been in a very difficult and abusive relationship herself. And I finally, for the first time, told someone like what it really looked like in our home and in my marriage. And I said, is this abusive? Like, I can't get this question out of my head. And I remember her saying to me, she was quiet for a moment, and she said, Alyssa, yeah, and I just lost it. Like, I'm sitting on my back deck, like tears just streaming down my face. But it took a few months for me to get to a place where I acknowledged that that's what was really going on. And then once I did, that's when I found a counselor. And because then I was like, okay, well, now if I'm going to acknowledge that this is abusive, then I have to do something about it. And so that's when I first started counseling. The first thing I did was go drive 1,200 miles to a different state to sit down and have lunch with my aunt, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist, because I wanted someone who I knew would be safe, and I wanted someone who my husband was not going to find out about, right? And since she was my aunt, I was like, well, even if he finds out I had lunch with her, like, there's a good explanation. And so I sat down and I told her my story. And the first thing she said to me was, Alyssa, when you leave here, your first call has to be to the domestic violence shelter in your town. And I was like, no. Like, I go back right into the resistance thing again. Like, no, I don't need that. Like, it's not like that. And she was like, Alyssa, yes, it is. Promise me when you leave here. And so that was like my second wake up call. Like, if someone who has been doing marriage counseling for 30 years, that's the first thing they're going to tell me. Oh, like, maybe I need to pay attention to that. So then I ended up coming back home and then finding my own counselor close to me. So yeah, that was my story. That's how I kind of got into counseling for the first time. And then I ended up also working with a coach who was trained in IFS, internal family systems. And that was really helpful for me too, in a completely different way. Like, my counselor and my coach both helped tremendously in kind of from different perspectives or working on different things.
There's so much that you said that just resonated with me. When you were talking about the realization of listening to somebody else's story and having it mirrored in your own life, and the way that when they said, I was in an abusive relationship, and then all of a sudden that light bulb moment comes where you're just like, I
No, I'm not.
no. Because again, like what you were saying, there's so much, being able to feel in our body. So everything that I do is coming at it through the lens of in the body. And you've mentioned this so many times, standing out in the driveway, and what the emotions are bringing into your body. That's just such an important aspect of all of this, having that not only connection to somebody else's story where we're hearing it and we're feeling it. What are the ways that you have changed some of the ways that your body reacts, or what are the practices that you're doing to be more in tune with connecting all of those points of not just the way that we stand in front of that person that we were in an abusive relationship with, and this can be a really long, drawn out question, because like what you said, I same thing. I was in a very abusive first marriage, and I thought, when the kid turns 18, I'm done. I can burn that bridge. I am good to go. And here we are, another 12 years later, and I'm like, I'm still having to deal with you. And so, like, having those moments where you show up and you just say, okay, I don't have to be engaged in your little drama fest that you're having over here. What are the ways that you, for yourself, and then also for your clients, how are you bringing the body into that, bringing the sensations of how to release the tension that we associate with the internal story the internal dialogue that we've got going on with that?
That's a great question. And this was hard for me because I am not a feeler. Like I mean, it depends on what what your reference is for personality types, but I am probably whatever personality type is the most detached from emotions, that's me. Okay. So this was a lot of work for me. And especially after another, 19 years of having to shove all that down and push it aside and not deal with it. So this took a lot of work for me. So two things that came up for me when you were talking there. The first thing is this is something my counselor told me that has helped me so much. And this was kind of going back to that point that you made about not getting involved in their emotional upheaval, right? Distancing yourself from that. She told me to remember the Looney Tunes cartoons from the 90s. Remember the Tasmanian Devil? And she said, so when your husband is having his little emotional moment, think of the Tasmanian Devil and his tornado, right? He would get so angry and worked up and he'd spin himself around and make the dust cloud and the little tornado. And she said, you right now think that when he has that tornado, it's your job to do something about it. And she said, I want to shift that a little bit for you. Your actual job is to just get out of the way and let him have his little tornado and stop sticking your hand in there or your foot in there or your whatever in there to try to stop it. She said, your only job is to stay out of the way and not get sucked in. And there was something about that visual for me that was so helpful, because then I was able to eventually start watching him. Like I knew the signs, right? I could see the little tiny signs that he was about to go off or get worked up. And my mindset shifted from, how do I stop it? How do I stop it? How do I fix it? How do I keep him from blowing up? To, oh, here he goes again, having his little tornado, right? And so that was a really helpful visualization for me. Like, there was something about having that mental picture that just really helped me a lot. And as far as the sensations in my body, um, I had to really practice this. And when I first started IFS coaching, this is when it really came up for me, because I don't know if you talk much about IFS on your show, or if your listeners are familiar, but IFS, internal family systems, is basically about recognizing that we have all these different parts inside of us. And, we even use this terminology. We say things like, part of me wants to do this, but the other part of me doesn't, right? And so, when part of the process of coaching through internal family systems is to start identifying where in your body you're feeling emotion. And so, so I would have to practice this. Like, she would give me these assignments. The next time you're feeling whatever, identify where you felt that in your body. And for me, I had to like actually lay in my bed at night and close my eyes and really focus in, because I was so out of touch with my body that I could not do that in the process of my daily life. I couldn't do it in the moment at all. And so that's what I would do. Like, I would lay in my bed at night with my eyes closed, and I would think back to a moment in my day when I felt really some kind of strong emotion. And I would have to take inventory of my body. Like, am I feeling this in my chest or in my stomach or in my shoulders or what? And, but once I started to practice that, then I started to get better at it. And now I'm getting to the place where I'm more in tune with my body, and I can tell like how my body responds when I walk into a room with someone. It tells me so much. Like, I did a video recently on social media that sort of blew up about how do you identify safe people? And one of the ways is when you walk in a room, your body will react in a certain way. And if you're in tune with your body and you notice that, it can tell you so much before you even have conversations with people. And so for me, it's like my shoulders come up, like my shoulders come up and my upper back tenses up. And when I feel that now, I recognize it and I know, like, okay, my body's trying to tell me something. I need to pay attention. But it wasn't something that came easily to me at all. Like, I just didn't have that mind-body connection at all at first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because of the expectations that all of us as human adults have, and children have on us all the time, it's a constant messaging to us throughout our day of like what your body is telling you. You have to hit the snooze button. Like, you are hungry right now,
Yes.
you are thirsty right now, but you don't have time, right, to eat something that's gonna help that hunger. So you got to ignore it. You got to ignore it. You got to ignore it. And because of that, we get so good at ignoring the messages that our body is sending us. So that tension in our muscles, our body is like, you got to pay attention to this, right? When we
Right.
stub our toe, our body sends us pain because it's like, don't do that again, right? You're going to lose your toe if you do that. And we get so I think programmed and just conditioned over time to ignore it, and to the point where we don't even notice it because it's so automatic that we ignore it. And I just love that, taking the time and going through that difficult process, because it is, by the time we're listening to our body, it's screaming. And so it's like, do I want to listen to a fire alarm all the time? It wasn't a fire alarm when it first showed up, right? But I didn't listen to it when it was a subtle low hum, right? Or when it was a pain in my hip or in my, and so I love what you're talking about, because it can be so scary to do that, because once it's built up like that, it can be like, oh, this is so much, and we can get so flooded while we're doing that. And the example you're showing and living of, take your time with it. When you go in there into your own mind, into your own being, into your own body, take your time. It's okay to tread lightly. It's encouraged to go like, I'm gonna see what's in there, and then I'm gonna reflect on just one thing that I see, right? Or that I feel. And I think it's so encouraging because there can be a temptation to feel like, well, if I go in there, I'm going to get totally flooded. Everything hurts, right? Like
Oh,
everything
yes.
raining messages at me at once. How could I ever put out all these fires? And it's like, no, I'm not gonna. I don't have to. I'm not going to. I'm going to look at one fire. I'm going to listen to one message from my body at a time. I just love that. I mean, I can relate here. I love that you talk about abusive relationships in the workplace as well. Because I think when we hear about conflicting relationships or relationships that have this abusive element to it, we think of intimate partner violence most frequently. And so I think that people are kind of a little bit like, okay, I know that exists, right? At least
Right.
it's so difficult to identify it in our own relationships. And I think especially when it comes to the workplace or with our adult children or with our parents as we're adults or with our siblings. And I, in my experience, I have experienced a abusive workplace relationship. And because of my own childhood trauma, a lot of my triggers come back to resources, finance, right? Like that's
Yeah.
what's going to feed me and my family, right? And so because of that, but I also grew up where I was like, I don't need a partner, whatever. If I get married, then great, and if not, whatever. But that's because that's where I associated as a child my safety, right? It was like, because like you talked about the detachment as a child, I was like, I had an insecure attachment style. I was like, I don't need anybody, right? And so I can't rely on people. I got to rely on my work. I have to rely on myself to do work so that I can make money so I can feed myself. And part of that was my boss at that time. And so it allowed for so many of these behaviors to be excused by me because I thought, well, that's just how it is. This is what I have to do. I can learn how to deal with it. But I didn't realize that it was an abusive relationship until because I was like, that's my boss. Like that's not, my boyfriend or girlfriend. So it can be
Yeah.
difficult to identify those.
Yes, absolutely. And somebody like a boss has a position of authority over us. And so then we feel this whole other layer of like, in order to keep my job, I have to put up with this. And that's not necessarily true. But the techniques and the tactics are different because of what you're looking to get out of that relationship. Like in an intimate relationship, we're looking for emotional connection, we're looking for validation, we're looking for like so many things um, that we don't necessarily need out of a boss, right? We just need a paycheck and we need to be respected. Right? It's a little bit different in terms of our expectations of the relationship, and so some of the techniques are different simply because the depth of relationship is different. But it is so important, like, to identify every relationship in our lives where we're allowing people to mistreat us, because all of those things affect us so much, even if we don't realize it, or even if it's once a week for 5 minutes, right? It still matters, and our bodies still carry that around. And I wanted to jump back really quickly to something you said right at the beginning when you were talking about the way that our body stores these emotions and stuff. One of the things for me that happened was over time, it sort of builds, like your body gets screams louder and louder. And about a few months before I left, I reached a point where I was having a panic attack every time I had to go home. And I wanted to say that because I think people don't realize that if you don't deal with it, your body just keeps screaming louder, right? Like I had, before I even got married, like looking back on it now, before I even got married, my body was telling me this is not a safe person. But over those years, it just escalated and escalated and escalated to the point where every time the thought of walking in my front door was bringing on a panic attack. And so, no matter where on that scale you find yourself, it's never too late or too early to start listening to your body. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
I love that. Absolutely. It is never too late to start that. And I love your lived example, because this was a long-term relationship. And you were still able to identify those signs by noticing what was happening with you and in your body and listening to that. I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah. And I mean, part of me, there have been times when I was like, Alyssa, how could you have let this go so far that your body had to start having panic attacks for you to pay attention, right? But we have to give ourselves so much grace because we only know what we know, right? And for me, because I was so out of touch with my body and my emotions, that's what it took. And so I now choose to kind of reframe that for myself and say, Alyssa, your body is so invested in protecting you and in keeping you safe that it just kept trying until you finally paid attention. And that's a good thing. Like, your body's working the way it was designed to work.
Yeah.
And so I try not to beat myself up about that and just reframe that differently for myself.
I love that perspective, because your body and your nervous system never let you down. It never stopped trying. And with people and relationships, we can't always guarantee that, but even when we're not listening to our body, to our feelings, to our thoughts, even when we're not listening, our body is still trying. And and we get mad at it because we're like, why does my leg hurt, right? Like, why are my shoulders so cramped? We get angry with it. But I love that, because it did not abandon you. It kept trying. And I just love that reframe of that. That is wonderful. Alyssa, we would love to have you on again. Oh my gosh, I could do this for another 5 hours. I love talking to you. This is so wonderful. So thank you so much for being here. And coachingwithalyssa.com. If you are listening and you are looking for coaching, we talked about the therapeutic process, but coaching is so important to have on your counseling team. You've got your therapist, maybe you have a therapist. Absolutely, that is wonderful. Coaching is separate but equal and so important. So look her up, coachingwithalyssa.com. She's in Texas, but you do online coaching as well?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes, I do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. This is wonderful. We also want to thank Eva of Eva ZobianWolf. Thank you so much for being here. I always love that you bring that perspective of that mind-body connection.
It was wonderful to be here. Thank you.
I'm Alyssa Decker, and I need a counselor.
And I'm Chrissa Hunt.
I'm Eva ZobianWolf.
And I'm Julie Johnson, and we need a counselor.
And so do you.
Bye.
So do you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the You Need a Counselor podcast. We are so grateful that you're here. Now, we want to hear from you. Text us or give us a call at 515-650-3231. You can also find and connect with You Need a Counselor on Facebook and Instagram. If you've enjoyed today's show, please take a moment to like, review, or leave a comment, as all of these things help others to find and benefit from the podcast as well. If you're in the state of Iowa and interested in mental health counseling or behavioral health intervention services, give us a call at 800-531-4236. We'll see you for the next episode, Sunday at 5.